Why isn't it working? Aha. Sorry, my first time with YouTube, I'm afraid. So it was a little bit sketchy there for a second. Welcome to everybody in the chat. Thank you very much for joining today. Just sort out the webcam a little bit. And today we're going to be talking about everything you want to know about the MCS, essentially. So what we're going to do is go back just a little bit on the chat. There were some questions back in about 5:30. So very eager students. That's great. This is from Rachel. In a paragraph, it's mentioned in the pre-scene that you would have an operating structure that has divisions. That is a great spot. I was actually thrown a little bit as well. I know somebody else asked about the organization chart as well, not having divisions, or at least demonstrating a functional structure and not actually having this very clear distinction that there's a division to it. So ultimately, what I took away from it is that the overarching structure is functional. So all the pros and cons that are related to that specific structure apply. So that's things like communication, etc. Whereas divisions are limited only to our operating structure. So just the production side of things is divisional. So that might have some of the drawbacks and benefits of a divisional structure. But overall, I think the main thing we should focus on is that organization chart. So with that in mind, we should just sort of take the organization chart as the sort of go-to, just to be safe. But in theory, if they reference the divisional structure, you could definitely use the pros and cons to that. Hey, Babbage FX, how are you doing today? The next one that I want to pick out real quick is from Adil Tahir. Hello. Is there any chance that a decision tree diagram might be tested? Ultimately, I pretty much doubt it, really. It's possible because, as we have discussed in some other content, we will be sharing this video later. Yeah, Babbage, sorry. So on the topic of a decision tree, we have got the sort of basis where we've got lots of different directions in which the company can go to expand. And that will take me to another question, actually, that I've seen. But ultimately, with these several different methods of growth, I doubt it's a decision tree. It's more likely to be, we have that hint in the role that more of our liability or responsibilities will be with some delegation from the finance director. It's very rare for the MCS to be so close to the finance director. Usually it's you, senior financial manager, finance director. But in this case, it's us, finance director. So it's a little bit of a blend with the strategic role there. So we need to be aware of that. And ultimately, I would suggest that we are probably going to be, focusing more on the actual E2 theories that we can apply to making decisions on that topic of where we go to grow. There was another question on expansion recently. Oh, the fundings, I think. Yeah, sorry, yeah. So it's from Anna. Hello there. We've got, so funding from the expansion, the cash has gone up, and so the retained earnings. That is correct. And yes, to some degree, we can use our cash. There's an important thing to note, though, is that we are ultimately a high capital business, really intensive on the capital. We're buying lots of materials, high quality materials, and we have that 12-month contract lock-in, remember. So we do need quite a lot of working capital and sort of buffering cash. It's not a technical term, but for risk management, you really want to have some reserves ahead of such a contract, really, with our customers. And we know we can only lose 30% of the cost to build a house, which is nice, but it's still quite a large amount when we think about how much the houses actually cost. So to answer the question about funding, the fact that we are completely ungeared and we do need to do quite a drastic approach to growth based on the shareholder conflict, it's probably going to be a large project unless we just choose to penetrate the market. But if we do those big, large-scale projects, I suspect debt should be our first port of call, in the sense that it's the largest area in which we can get cash from, because we have no other gearing. We have a lot of assets to securitize it with. So with that in mind, I would probably go debt for large projects. Cash can supplement large projects, or can be, for smaller projects. And then potentially, I don't think this is a topic coming up, but potentially they could throw in a curveball regarding going public for a large IPO, get funding that way. So we've got a lot of chat here at the moment. 1 second, let me just find another one. Just a quick one I found. So the topics that we can rule out, the short answer to that, ultimately, is none, unfortunately. The way in which the MCS works is that they have 4 questions, right? And they each have 2 tasks, or rather 4 tasks, 8 questions. So you've got 8 different things to answer, essentially. Usually the 2 to each task linked together. And what they do is they often build up to a point where there's some element that's really kind of different from the pre-scenes, is testing your application. Because if you could get 100% of the exam correct just from the pre-scene, then they wouldn't really add any unseen material, would they? Too much. They would just ask a question about the pre-scene. So the short answer and the the sort of complete answer to that is that we can't rule out anything, unfortunately. Though I would love to be that kind of fortune teller, I cannot, and nobody can really. What else have we got in regards to? Do focus on the case as well. Okay, so I'll address this one because it's a general point that will help everybody. Is the way in which the MCS works, if you are a gateway student, or it's your first time taking the MCS, or even if you're retaking, the sort of core basis of the MCS is regarding E2. OCS has a lot of P2 in it, and don't get me wrong, every module, P1, sorry, I should say. Don't get me wrong though, all the modules are really, really important because they're all relevant to different aspects and the contexts. However, ultimately, the theory is the basis now. It's moving more towards monitoring a strategy. So we're monitoring how the strategy from senior management is actually carried over into our business. And we're that person around here in the middle of the process, making sure it's all ticking over. We don't make the decisions. We just make sure it's working, it's functioning. So that puts an extra emphasis on our strategic understanding, which ultimately leads us to the E topics. So for example, if we're thinking about expansion and where we can go for growth, we are going to be thinking about something along those, maybe foreign expansion. So we could talk about Porter's Diamond, right? So with that in mind, you've got an E2 topic, and then you can bring in your different elements that are relevant to the case or relevant to the context that they put in to the unseen material. But you see that it's grounded in the E's, right? That's the foundation, and then you're sort of iterating on it with your P2 and F2 knowledge, depending on the context. For the gateway students, I would highly recommend just really brushing up on P2, F2, and E2 if you're able to get your hands on any material. I know it sounds rather dull, not very inspired, but the pass rates for gateway students are way, way lower than for students that have gone through the operational levels and through the modules leading up to MCS. And that is just because of familiarity. So I would recommend you get as much sort of quick revision as you can on all the topics that is in F2, E2, P2, and then try your hand at mocks and make sure you're really familiar. Really make sure nothing's going to throw you, because you want to be comfortable in terms of what you're doing, and you want to have no nasty surprises on topics where you don't quite understand what they're asking. In terms of the length of task, so we have 45 minutes a task essentially, which is correct. So ultimately, it's quite straightforward. We should only be, we should be divvying up each requirement equal amounts. So there's 2 requirements for each task. So you're going to spend about 22.5 minutes roughly on writing each. I would highly, highly recommend that you chop 5 minutes off that 45-minute time and plan. Structure and the way in which you answer it is really fundamental. Like, it is absolutely crucial to turning what's up here into an actual like grade that you were happy with, right? Because it's very easy. Well, it's not easy. It's hard, in fact. But the actual understanding of all the topics is not the be all and end all. Actually, it's about getting it onto the page. So I would recommend you want to structure your answers. Make a little plan. So like intro. What's the intro? Well, if it's hinting that they want to talk about performance management and we don't have a specified way of managing our performance or measuring it rather, then we're looking at balanced scorecard perhaps. If you decide balanced scorecard's how you want to answer this question, or you can introduce the balanced scorecard and your first paragraph can be on one perspective, then the next, and how it applies, right? So you can do like perspective, like customer perspective, what it is, how it applies, point, done. Like that's your paragraph. That's planned now. You have it up here. You're ready. You know that that's how you're going to go about it. So definitely plan, because the way in which you, apologies for the background noise if you can hear that, the way in which you plan it is fundamental. Like you really want to get it on the page well, because that is ultimately where the examiners are going to gain your understanding from. So if you do a poor job of getting it on the page, it doesn't matter how actually you could be amazing at all modules and everything. But if you don't get on the page well, then you will suffer, unfortunately. Agnieszka, nice to see you. Hi, what about issues relating to financial reporting? IFRS obviously should be analyzed. Yeah, so IFRS is where we're being, well, what's applicable to that jurisdiction. That's always the case with the MCS. They always have to, like, well, in every case study, I believe, they just have to state that to remind you that you're liable to, present things all throughout the IFRS regulations. And that is basically them saying, we can give you a question on financial reporting, because remember, they have to test you on F2, but they also don't give you calculations to do. Like there's no calculations that you need to do in the case study. So with that in mind, it's their way of presenting, their ways of, testing F2 essentially. And it's probably going to come down to some kind of reporting. For example, if we're thinking about foreign expansion, and that's a potential way of growing, which we need to do, we know. Well, if you acquire a subsidiary rather in a foreign country, well, then you become a group. So then we've got group accounts and the IFRS related to that. So with that in mind, that's kind of where the IFRS is going to go. It's more of a general statement of them saying, be aware of the IFRS, because it's one of the few things we can actually test you on in regards to F2, because they do have the rule of not testing calculations, only understanding at the case study level. 74 and all your competencies were moderate. I suspect you can pick up a few more marks in regards to integration. It might be how well, I don't know if they specified on your marks how many integration points you got, but I believe there is up to 3 or 5. Someone will have to correct me if they are aware, where they're just discretionary marks on how like well you've done the whole answer. So it's not just a case of, oh, they've answered it and I like it. It's more a case of, how is it all tied together? Have they used some examples? All that kind of stuff. That's a nice, easy way to pick up marks, just rounding out your answers with a little touch of extra, like, suave, if you know what I mean. Like requirement 1 and requirement 2 of the task link well together. Like it's a very nice linear way of going through the problem. And on top of that, if you have any real world examples, that does help a bunch as well. In terms of 74, it's not necessarily always about how much you write. It may be that you just missed out 1 or 2 points that they were looking for, potentially. There's a whole manner of different reasons as to why it might be slightly lower. 74 is definitely not a bad score for your first attempt as a gateway student. Gateway students definitely find it harder. So Yeah, that's actually relatively accurate, Adil. We recommend about 15 points per question, but 13 is roughly like, if you were to break it down like you did, that's essentially where we're at in terms of writing. With regards to integration, is it more with bringing in the pre-seen or more the unseen? It's a bit of both, really. It's like, as it sort of suggests in terms of the name, it's about getting all the information that you have, pre-seen, unseen, and what's up here, and just bringing it together into quite a nice, well-rounded answer. You won't get punished for leaving certain things out unless, unless it wasn't like you've missed something. You know what I mean? Like, unless you've really missed a key point, you're not going to be punished because you missed a tiny point or a small point on XYZ. You're gonna, you're gonna get good marks because you've got most of the main aspects which they're looking for. For example, a recent examiner report discussed how they were doing about a finance question on funding, and they were confused as to why very few students talked about the cash in the company. Believe it or not, when the way it must have been the way it was asked or something, but many students were talking about, like debt funding, IPOs, all the different options, and they did it very well. But they really left off the fact that the company had loads of cash, like really high cash reserves. So with that in mind, if you just leave that out completely and not even talk about it, even if you think debt is the best option, you should at least reference it, especially if there's a lot of cash. Obviously, like if there's a lot of cash, it makes no sense to ignore it. So as long as you don't leave anything out major, you're fine. But ultimately, you're looking for that nice, well-rounded answer that kind of doesn't go off in a tangent. You want to consider everything. But if you don't think it's important, it's just important to talk about it a little bit. Make it very brief. We're talking about short paragraphs, really nailing it. 13 to 15 range of 3 to 4 line paragraphs. That's your aim, really. And 3 to 4 lines might seem really small, but actually, it's just about helping the examiner understand you. You don't want to cloud their understanding. You want to point. Sorry, I have my own. Let me find it. My own sort of acronym for these kinds of ways we do the paragraph, and essentially, it is about getting the point, and then also expanding on how, or justifying it essentially, and then you've got like the evidence that comes with it. So with that in mind, then we've got sort of like a PJE system, in terms of acronym. But yeah, you want a nice, well-rounded, short answers, like really lots of points, short, to the no like fluff. Don't try and make it fancy. They just want to know what you know, essentially. Let's have a look. What else have we got? So we've got IFRS as a question, IFRS 16. Let me just make sure I am thinking of the correct IFRS in terms of leases. Okay, sure. Leases in general, it did change a little bit in regards to how it's regulated. As of January 1st, it's being tested. But in this case, in particular, I would be quite surprised if we did any leasing, to be perfectly honest. The reason being is that we are a top-end company. We're premium. We're probably going to want any sort of core competencies, so like machinery, like important machinery, important software. We're probably going to want that to be like an outright purchase. We want to have the licensing and all that kind of stuff and the actual machinery owned in whole. It's very unlikely that we're going to want to lease that kind of thing, even if it's the short option for a project. Given that we are looking to not only expand but also just be the top end, having it in-house and not having full ownership of it is kind of where the company's going to be at. It would be quite a random inclusion from the examiner to put IFRS 16, but again, based on what I said earlier, we cannot rule it out. In terms of paragraphs per question, yeah, it's around 13 to 15, Anna. You want to do 3 to 4 lines, maybe 6 at a push. Like you really are looking at 4 to 6 really as a range for each paragraph. You can make smaller points in 2 to 3 lines, and then you might want to do a larger paragraph after that to sort of bring it all together. But overall, on average, like 4, 5, 6 lines at a push and 13 to 15 paragraphs for each requirement. And that's going to give you a good platform. The important part, though, is if you find yourself struggling to get that kind of amount, don't force it. If you force it and confuse the examiner, it makes it more difficult to award you marks. Do you know what I mean? Like, the examiner won't punish you for writing slightly unclearly, but it does make it difficult for them to fully understand what you mean. So you really want to make sure that you aren't sort of forcing words onto the page. Make sure, or onto the screen. Make sure that they are points they're relevant, and if you don't come up with enough points, that might be just okay. I mean, we're talking about the sort of ideal scenario. Underneath those amounts, well, you are running the risk of losing out on some marks, of course, but it's not going to automatically fail you. Yeah, so make sure it's focused. That's a really good question, actually, in terms of how we are talking in the exam. What you want to do is discuss it with the sort of respect of who you're talking to. So, say, for example, we have some delegation from our finance director, and we have to respond to them with a report or something like that. You want to speak to them with the respect of, they're the finance director, they're more senior to you, so professionally. But also, you want to discuss any terms that they demonstrate as being unclear, as a sort of like as if they're learning it for the first time. If there's nothing specified that's not clear, so for example, if they said, "Can you do a report on how I don't know, how IFRSs will, how group accounts and gaining this subsidiary will affect our financial reporting?" Well, you're going to need to explain IFRS and how those different IFRSs apply and all the things we have to do, essentially. But if it says, what does this IFRS do or mean for our way of operating? Well, in that scenario, you can assume they know the IFRS they're talking about and not introduce the IFRS. You can just go straight in as to why and what it does, rather than explain, like introducing it. So if they suggest they don't know, introduce the topic. If they haven't specified anything, so how can we best measure our performance? If they haven't mentioned balanced scorecard, feel free to introduce balanced scorecard. But if they do say, how can the balanced scorecard help us? Well, then you can kind of skip the intro. In terms of weighting, there's not really a clear distinction in the sense that they're broken down into technical marks, leadership marks, etc. That is the official breakdown. And to be perfectly honest with you, the way those categories are set out, they are not directly correlated to any particular module, like specifically. To some degree, they kind of are. Like technical is going to be more P2, F2, and leadership will be more E2. So there are like stronger, like some modules are more likely to be in certain questions than others, or using certain marks than others. But there isn't like a very clear weighting per module. I would recommend that you obviously know all modules, but the bread and butter, which I always talk about, is E2. You need to know your theories, you need to know how they apply. Even if you don't use a theory or use a module, those theories do inform you as to what you can talk about as part of a problem. You don't always need to use a model or a theory, but you do want to use the knowledge of those theories to help you, if that makes sense. You don't have to say like Hertzberg said this about motivation, but you can say, motivation has a direct impact on, employee efficiency, etc. How effective is MCS mock test with markings of feedback? If you are referring to ours, we do have very, very good reviews on our mock tests with marking, especially the feedback. That students very much like it. I don't actually do them, but we have a team of markers that are very, very talented at that kind of thing, very, very experienced. You can check out on Trustpilot all the reviews for our content, and you don't need me to search you. If you take a quick look at our Trustpilot, you'll see that there's lots and lots of positive reviews about our case study materials, and also especially the marking and feedback. Students are really happy with that. Yeah, so that's what I was kind of getting at. I would love to say your name accurately. I just don't want to get it wrong. So with the modules, they sometimes will specify and sometimes they won't. And when they don't, you want to introduce it. If they introduce it to you as like I said, like how does balanced scorecard help us, or what can it do for us? Well, then you don't need to introduce what it is. You just need to introduce the relevant bits, like the customer's perspective will help us do X, Y, Z. But if they haven't specified and they've just asked for a performance measurement / management sort of system, then you can introduce balanced scorecard and the different perspectives, and then talk about how each perspective can be useful. As you said, practical exam questions is the key, especially based on a case study. Is there a list of questions apart from the work relevant to George Holmes that we can practice? If I'm really honest, if you have used all our mocks, as I'm always going to favor the mocks that we do. I think they're very good. But if you've used those and you want more practice, to be perfectly honest with you, you do just look for more mocks from other providers. I wouldn't know personally how good a different provider is, so I can't speak to that. But ultimately, if you're like completely starved of more practice and you really want to keep going, then I guess you are looking at other providers as well. I'm glad you think so, Arlan. I have missed a pass by a couple marks twice, but was scored moderate in all areas. I focus on planning, writing, time management skills for the swimming. Would you recommend revising theory? It's a tough one because the case study is so applied. It's challenging because you obviously need to revise and you need to understand all the topics that can come up. But I think the best way to score highly in the exam is to go through that process of mock exams. It's not fun. It's not like groundbreaking. Doesn't change the wheel. But ultimately, you want to be able to turn your knowledge from what's up here onto the page. And what especially helps if you have somebody you know who's passed the MCS, or if you want to get marking from us or somewhere else, the marking and feedback kind of aspects, regardless of where it's from or who it's from, are very, very important because you want to be very clear. You want to really understand the question and you want to answer it as clearly as possible. We often recommend in our exam answers to always give small sort of titles to each paragraph or each couple of paragraphs. For example, if we were asking a question on group accounts, right? One of our first section or first few paragraphs might be IFRS, like the ones that are appropriate as a title, explaining what they do, what they are, what they force us to do. And then the second paragraph might be, what they actually, cause us to change, the relevance, all that kind of stuff. And then your next stage might be, I don't know, if it's something to do with acquiring a subsidiary or the sort of how we treat certain aspects of their financials, then you would have a different title for that bit, which would then relate to the IFRS, which you've just explained. But that again is only applicable, the first part, if they haven't specified their knowledge of IFRS. If they do, then how much do our mocks cost? To be honest, I am not an expert. Let me have a quick look. I'll just check that for you in a second, Rachel, whilst it loads. Pranav, can you please provide brief understanding on integration? Okay, so integration is essentially how well you answer it. Not necessarily, obviously you need to be accurate, but it's not just about getting it right. It's about how well it ties all together. One of the good ways in which you can always sort of get the integration marks is to make sure every paragraph, without fail, has a very brief reminder of how it applies. So if you never forget to put a short, very short line on the end of your paragraphs or end of your 2-paragraph section, whatever you want to call it, as long as you link it back, say why it's important, why does this answer the question? If you have that in your head, why am I writing this? How does it apply? Make sure you have that on the page in a very sort of brief but very clear way. Then you're going to pick up those integration marks. For example, the 2 tasks in the requirement often have a link. Usually the first one relates to the second one. Getting that link like in a nice flowing way of describing the link is quite nice. So if you conclude on point 1 and then you say XYZ is then, helps us understand this next point, and then we talk about the next point. Just having those nice sort of writing style, but also focused, really focused and well written. That's what you're looking for integration. Yeah, it's a difficult one to do as far as scripts go, because obviously CIMA don't release anyone's scripts to the public or to any sort of institution. So we wouldn't be able to, I don't think it's possible to get that, but it would be very helpful for sure. Junior, yes. IFRS is often talked about. I mentioned it a bit earlier. Essentially, because they can't test you on calculations, to get F2 testing, like to test you on F2, they often resort to things like the IFRS. There's loads of them, obviously. And group accounts is very popular. Given that we need to expand, I would at least know group accounts, but I would suggest that you should go over F2 mostly based on the reporting aspects, because you do not have to calculate, for sure. You do not have to do that, but it will help to know all the reporting regulations and how they're applicable, because essentially that's the one of the few ways they can test you: funding and reporting. That's kind of where they're pigeonholed into. So if you've got those 2 things down, you're probably okay on F2, and then you can focus on the other modules. With that said, we are slightly over time. I hope that this was really useful. If you have any further questions, feel free to post it on via email or at inquiries@Astranti, or you can find me on Facebook. It's Joseph Bowen Astranti. If you put that into Facebook, you'll be able to find me. And I have a page, you can message that page, etc. The conclusion, I'll just answer this quick one before I go. The conclusion is important for integration marks, but you don't necessarily have to conclude. It's not a requirement. It won't make or break your answer, but it can be helpful for integration. But with that said, thank you very much for tuning in. It was a pleasure. And again, if you have any further questions, please direct them to either Facebook or email, and we'll get back to you. So thank you very much for listening. I'll type it in. If you email this address, this will then get forwarded to me depending on the question. So like if you ask something about the MCS, I'll get it. If you ask something about P3, somebody else on the team will get it who knows more about P3. But thank you all for tuning in. Really appreciate the support. And yeah, I will see you another time.